Good afternoon and happy Earth Day. I'm Warwick Saban, Executive Director of the Society of Fellows, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this SOF digital discussion. I hope you and your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I want to thank you for being part of the Society of Fellows. And on February 19th, President Joe Biden used his first address before a global audience to declare that America is back, the Transatlantic Alliance is back. In response, the European Council President said, "Welcome back, America," but other world leaders were not as warm or enthusiastic. Not only is there skepticism about America's commitment to its allies and its values, but there have been direct challenges to America's strength and standing in the world by its rivals. And with the recent announcement of the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, and as tensions mount with Russia and China, there are a lot of ways to assess whether America, in fact, is back. Fortunately for us, we have a truly outstanding panel of experts to help us unpack all of the issues for the next hour. Rageh Omaar is the International Affairs Editor for ITV News and the presenter of the ITV Current Affairs program On Assignment. Previously, he was Senior Foreign Correspondent for the BBC, and he has won numerous awards, including a Peabody Award for his reports from Darfur and a BAFTA for his coverage of the invasion of Afghanistan. He's also made numerous documentaries and has published 2 books. Anne-Marie Slaughter is the CEO of New America and a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton University. She served as director of policy planning at the US State Department from 2009 to 2011, and before that, she was dean of Princeton's School of Public and International Affairs. She also taught at Harvard Law School and has written or edited 8 books and over 100 scholarly articles. Currently, she is a contributing editor of the Financial Times and writes a bi-monthly column for Project Syndicate, while also providing frequent commentary on broadcasts and social media. Constanze Stelzenmuller is the inaugural Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations in the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. Previously, she held the Kissinger Chair on Foreign Policy and International Relations at the Library of Congress and was a senior transatlantic fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. She was a political editor for a leading German weekly and has contributed to a wide range of publications, including Foreign Affairs, the Financial Times, and the International New York Times. She's also a frequent commentator on American and European radio and television. And today's discussion will be moderated by our own Niamh King, who is Deputy Director of the Aspen Strategy Group and the Aspen Security Forum. She previously served as the Vice President for Programs and Strategic Content at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and before that, she held positions with Intel, the European Commission, and the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And as with all of our SOF digital discussions, our panelists will be glad to answer your questions after the initial conversation, and you can submit your questions anytime by simply clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and typing them in. And if you encounter any problems at all during the event, please email our SOF hotline, and our team will be glad to assist you. Our panelists will now be in conversation for the next 45 minutes, and then I'll pose your questions to them for the rest of the event. And now it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Niamh King. Niamh?
Thanks, Warwick. Thank you very much for the privilege of doing this today, and thanks to the Society of Fellows for your support of the Aspen Institute. I'm delighted to be here today with this broad-ranging panel so we can cover the question, is America back? I think this question encapsulates a large question of trust the world over and domestically. 74 million Americans voted for President Trump, and after what many would characterize as a disruptive 4 years, and with, as Warwick referenced, President Biden's comment at the Munich Security Conference in February, we just want to unpack this and see what to think. I'm going to kick it off with Anne-Marie. Anne-Marie, you are CEO of New America. And we know that your mission is to renew the promise of America. And so I'd just like to hear how your mission aligns with what you think President Biden is trying to do. And if in fact you do think America's back. Look at January 6th, there are a lot of big questions looming out there about democracy, infrastructure, jobs. Where are you on this question, please?
So thanks, Niamh, and I'm delighted to be able to talk to all of you. And I love the Aspen Fellows group. America is back in one, clear way. We are back as a multilateral problem-solving nation. And that way, when President Biden said America's back, it means we're once again at the climate change table. We're once again at development tables. We're back to the Iran nuclear talks. We are a country that thinks we have a major role in the world, and we're working with our allies to solve global problems and meet challenges. In that way, we're back. In every other way, in particularly how we think of ourselves as a leader and how other countries look to us as a leader, I'm not sure what we would be back to. There was a lot of questioning of that role even before the Trump administration. But also, given what we're going through right now, my advice in the Financial Times was we should think of ourselves as a new leader and behave as a new leader with all that involves, rather than any kind of returning leader. And that goes to your question about what we are at home. And I will say this is not ideological for me. I left a lot of my foreign policy work in 2013, except for the Aspen Strategy Group, of course. But a lot of my foreign policy work in 2013, when Obama was president, because I thought the country was so broken. And as a foreign policy person, I would look around and think, we're trying to lead the world. We can't educate our own people. Our infrastructure makes me cry. Every time I get onto a European train or a Chinese train or a Japanese train or an Indian first class train, I want to cry. I mean, or arrive at a major airport. Our racial tensions already then, I mean, we are not, I would say we're partly a democracy. We are not representative. We are not representing all of our people, and we are certainly not exercising power in a way that leads to majority results. So America shouldn't be back. America needs to go forward to a very different equilibrium. And I'll just say one or two things, and then I want to hear from my fellow panelists. In 2026, it'll be the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. By 2027, the Americans under 30, there will be no white majority. There will be a plurality. And by 2040, somewhere in there, it'll be a plurality country. That is an enormous change, and it is accompanied by a technological change as great as the first and second and probably third industrial revolutions roll together. We need to build a country that is genuinely a plurality country, politically, in terms of our education, in terms of all of the way we earn our living, all of our gaps. And we need to build a country that is really suited for the 21st century and those technologies. And for me, that actually precedes declaring to the world that we're back to lead everybody. We've got as much to learn as to teach.
Great. Just while we're sticking on domestic topics, Amory, I wanted to recommend to the audience the brilliant piece that you wrote about Rosie the Riveter and how we rethink about infrastructure and jobs. There's been a conversation, as many of you know, about the new bill. Is it infrastructure? Is it jobs? Which way are we supposed to think about it? You make a great point about the glass ceiling. Plenty of women get helped through the glass ceiling for careers, but not for caring. And I think that's what you mean when you talk about a more holistic American society that can be a leader at the table. Could you tell our audience a little bit about that piece and how you're thinking about what that new America actually looks like?
Yes, absolutely. And the point was simply President Biden's jobs bill talks about a care infrastructure and recognizes that facilities for child care or elder care are part of critical infrastructure, as we recognized during World War II, and frankly, as we recognized during the pandemic. But immediately, there were a lot of people, men, who said, that's not infrastructure. Infrastructure are bridges and roads and ports and broadband. To which I said, infrastructure is what is essential to allow us to do our jobs. So if America is truly representative, and if you have an equal number of women and caregiving men, because there are many, many more caregiving men than often we recognize, or sometimes they don't want to admit, then what's essential to do our jobs, and we've seen this through the pandemic, is an infrastructure of care, that it is just as important to have child care facilities for anyone who needs it, elder care, ways in which we can be, yes, whole people, not just competitive career people. I'm all for that. I fought fought for that much of my life, but equally people who connect to others and care for those whom we love, whether we're biologically related to them or not. So yes, that's very much part of the new America I want to see.
Yeah, I loved your point too about President Biden perhaps being sympathetic to this, as he was a single parent himself, wasn't he, in the 70s? So now we'll cross the Atlantic and head over to Raghi, who is based out of London. So Raghi, it's also been a tumultuous few years in the UK. Brexit, a very messy extraction from the European project, maybe some other disruptive people running the Houses of Parliament. What's your view on America being back and the kind of view on the ground there, please?
Well, I think, I'd echo what was said earlier by Anne-Marie. I think, first of all, I think that there is a scaling back of the sort of collective whiplash that we've all been sort of going through over the last sort of 4 years with the nature and conduct of the Trump presidency. So when President Biden sort of says America is back, yes, it sort of spells a return to a sense of multilateral, rules-based sort of, diplomatic norms that America has led for decades. But I think that there is another point, that the world has changed dramatically from the point of Europe, but also I think in terms of this, what might be called the developing world, whether that's in Africa or the Middle East or elsewhere, in the sense that America, if it is back, is returning to a very, very different world in which America is seen in very, very different ways. I think one of the most interesting ways is to sort of think of who is interested or who is pleased to see America return to this. I mean, it's one thing if you were to put that point to the Israelis in terms of, returning to the JCPOA, in terms of engaging with the Palestinian National Authorities, restoring funding and all of that. I suspect that that's probably under the Netanyahu government, not something that they're so keen to see, as well as, Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. I think the other thing that is very, very important to suggest that whilst it's early days to sort of see form put to what Biden means of, America coming back. I mean, climate change, I think, is one clear sort of point. We're speaking on Earth Day. I mean, the announcements today, if you look at the sort of targets that have been set by many other countries, has been the lead that's been set by Biden. But looking into America from the outside, I think the last 4 years has revealed in a very, very stark and naked way some sort of fundamental disconnects that is present in America and in America's politics. So is America back? But we look at the complete polarization in American sort of politics. We see where the Republican Party is and where it was, in the era before sort of Trump. So there's lots of sort of different senses in which America may be back in the international sense of multilateralism and in terms of rules-based system. But what is America returning back to and how does it conduct itself is an altogether different question.
Yeah, great. And, Raghi, because you spent a lot of time in Iraq and thinking about the Middle East, there was definitely a dip in kind of America's leadership, I think, during the Iraq War, particularly in the UK. What do you think made America so much more resilient then than it may be now?
I mean, you mean in terms of its resilience in how?
Its international reputation, because I think a lot of people questioned, Tony Blair was the lapdog of George W. Bush, but somehow or other, America did come back under President Biden, even though there wasn't that much dramatic, and we remained in Afghanistan and Iraq at the time. Do you feel like there was a resilience then that may not exist now?
No, I think that the resilience is there, but one mustn't sort of see, in some senses, the Trump administration as an enormous aberration in terms of when Biden, when you ask that question here in London or elsewhere in the Middle East and beyond about America being back. I mean, there are certain things that Donald Trump put into place with regard to foreign policy. I know we're going to get onto the idea of sort of Afghanistan, the forever wars, but there are certain things that Trump spoke to, which I think are going to sort of continue. So we mustn't sort of, look at America absolutely in stark black and white between sort of, there's going to be a complete volte face under Biden. I don't think there's anyone that feels that is the case, that in certain areas, whether it's in policy towards China, whether it's in policy towards withdrawing from the wars that was started in 9/11, I think there is certain continuity in some ways.
That's right. That's right. And Constanze, we'll move on to you. You're covering the island of stability in Europe. We've had 16 years of Chancellor Merkel, and for the audience, I highly commend Constanze's piece in Foreign Affairs, a brilliant story of Chancellor Merkel's history from being a small chemist in East Germany to her rise to being whom she is today, with lots of questions about what might happen in September at the election. So talk to us about the German and kind of macro transatlantic perspective about America being back, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. First off, thank you for inviting me to speak here. And it's wonderful to be on this panel with Anne-Marie and with Rageh Omaar. It's really a pleasure. On Germany, the island of stability, I don't know. I think it's important to say for our listeners that I do live in Washington, D.C. and of course have been stuck here since the beginning of the pandemic. But, bless the internet. When I was going to graduate school in America, longer ago than I care to admit, the only news source I had was from Germany was old German newspapers that were a week old and that people hadn't nicked from the library. So I do feel that I've been in relatively close touch, and frankly, while if you've lived in Washington for the past year in particular, and if you lived through January 6th, stability is a relative word. But I think one has to say that German politics has of late become very fragile, very volatile, and very fraught. There is just a sort of glum and somewhat sour mood in German politics these days, which I think sort of got something of an uptick with the selection of Annalena Baerbock as the Chancellor candidate of the Greens. But still, the Germans, about half a year ago, everybody's saying how wonderfully the Germans had managed the pandemic, how everything was science-based and under control and so on. And, for the last 6 months at least, it hasn't looked so good. And also the Germans, it has to be said, I love them. They are my people, but they, they were whining about conditions that were much less severe than what the poor Italians, the Brits, the French and the Spanish had been undergoing. And, that's never an attractive look, frankly. So, I think we're joining the middle right now. The CDU, since you were asking about the leadership selection process, the CDU has just brought behind it a leadership selection process that looked awfully like a circular firing squad to everybody concerned, presumably also to the participants. And as soon as they had finally settled on Armin Laschet, the Minister President of North Rhine-Westphalia, a day after, the Greens, in an extraordinarily polished performance, said, oh yeah, we're fielding the woman, Annalena Baerbock, who is an impressive candidate at barely 40. There was a Forsa poll published that had the Greens pulling ahead of the CDU for not quite the first time, but with a stunning lead of 7 percentage points, and the CDU down 6 percentage points to 21. That's just miserable. So for the first time in German post-war history, we're looking at the distinct possibility of a Green chancellor, 40 years old. And again, while she's impressive, she's, I think, a very competent and very intelligent woman with a sort of very clear system of values and political coordinates. I think it's only fair to say that she also hasn't had any government experience. So things remain somewhat exciting. And there are a lot of, I'm not, I don't want to go on too long. So I think there's also a lot of sort of underlying fundamentals, much like the ones that Anne-Marie was talking about, that one could adduce in this to explain why Germany's mood is so bad. Infrastructure, the AfD still being around, and then all the foreign policy challenges, which, are getting very worrying. And it explains why we're looking at a period of considerable volatility and possibly introversion, which is, I don't think, what the Biden administration wants right now.
Okay, great, thanks. And Anne-Marie, you touched gently on the topic of democracy, and one of the things that President Biden's talking about is a democracy summit. And you talked about us being multilateral, back at the table. Do we deserve to be at the head of the table at the democracy summit? Are you in favor of it, or what do you think?
Well, I would definitely have a round table.
Okay, that's a good diplomat's answer.
But I think it's very interesting when the summit was first proposed, and now Secretary of State Blinken had a piece in Foreign Affairs a year ago or so with Robert Kagan, and they were talking much more about a summit of democracies. And that was, in fact, President Biden's Foreign Affairs article, which I assume Secretary of State Blinken certainly saw the draft of, talked about the free world, as in the free world that I grew up with. My kids think the free world is a music group of some kind, right? They have no idea that that's supposed to mean, the democracies versus the autocracies, or of course, formerly communist states. It has morphed, and it's now the Summit for Democracy. That's a very different thing. I think that's much better, both because, yes, I do not think the United States should be giving lessons in democracy right now. I mean, just on the most fundamental, or one of the most fundamental dimensions of democracy, it is time for us to move to a version of a multi-party system. Presidential systems are less stable. Presidential systems are also much worse at getting things done unless you have a very authoritarian president, as we've just experienced. And really, it's time for us to move to some kind of ranked choice voting, some way that allows Americans to vote for more than two parties who often do not represent them. So the Summit for Democracy makes sense. Fundamentally, it means also that the United States has supported a number of things: the Community on Democracies, the Open Government Partnership, various ways of trying to divide countries around the world. It's not so easy, and countries don't like being divided. And I think the Biden administration realized that declaring that this group of countries were democracies and this group of countries were not was a very bad idea. Last thing I'll say is, if the Biden administration were really serious about strengthening democracies in the world, it would be looking east rather than west. It would be focusing on the EU much more than on Asia, at least to start. It would be really taking Ursula von der Leyen up on her proposal for a new agenda. I'd go further than an agenda. I'd talk, if not an alliance, at least a kind of entente. I would talk about climate. I'd talk about internet governance, talk about industrial policy, areas where if the US and the EU are aligned, they don't have to be the same, but if they're aligned, then lots of other things get much easier. And you don't have to be constantly talking about who's a democracy and who is not. You just talk about a set of values and move forward that way.
Yeah, thanks. So Raghi, last month, the integrated review was announced, which was a pretty significant piece of policy to announce what the post-Brexit global Britain is going to look like. And I think some of the critiques of this might be that it was a little
incoherent.
Incoherent, yes, would be. Thank you. You can say that. I'm the diplomatic moderator here, so I won't say that. And maybe it suffered a little bit from delusions of grandeur about their place in the world.
Yeah.
So love to hear your views on that, but love to hear how you think America fits in the picture, because I think it's kind of safe to say that Prime Minister Johnson, I'd like to call him that instead of just Boris, because it makes him seem like a friend and casual. Yeah. So how does America fit into that picture? People expected that he wanted President Trump to come back. It was going to be easier to get a free trade agreement. There wouldn't be a very proud Irish American president in America who was sitting in Washington, telling people he was Irish when it comes to the Good Friday Agreement. Talk to us through how that all worked, please.
Right. Okay. I'll try and unpack those in as quickly as possible. Otherwise, I could take up the whole sort of allotted sort of space we got for the rest of the program. I mean, first of all, I agree with Anne-Marie. I mean, I think if you sort of say in terms of America's back, who will be most sort of pleased, and sort of draw up a list. I'd put the EU right up there for all the sort of various reasons that she alluded to. I think this government here in the UK is probably one of the ones that would say, not sure about America back under Biden, you know, because there is, if you look up and down the Obama alumni and their views, I suppose, in the Biden administration, their views of Boris Johnson and his sort of conduct whilst foreign secretary and otherwise, I think there's not a lot of sort of, you know, personal warmth towards him, his closeness to Donald Trump, but much more than that, the underpinnings of populism that they share from the sort of same hymn sheet. I just want to go back to what Anne-Marie was talking about a gathering of sort of for democracy. And I think it's important to point out that when one speaks about America being back, that there are alternatives to America that are on the table for countries around the world. Leave aside sort of Europe, but I'm talking about the sort of the developing world, whether it's Russia, whether it's China in terms of its Belt and Road Initiative and economic sort of development in sub-Saharan Africa, in which you find countries. First of all, I mean, one can talk about the China debt trap, but it is undeniable if you've ever sort of traveled anywhere in Africa, the enormous infrastructure impact that, you know, 15 to 20 years of a head start that China has had over the United States and the European Union in that. But I think it's very sort of important, I think, for me that we grapple with the idea that there are alternatives to democracy, and that how the United States moves forward in underpinning when it talks about democracy, that is going to take, whether it's soft power, whether it's certain investments, whether it's talk about sort of climate, that there has to be flesh on the bones. Just coming forward and saying, we're back, we're for liberal Western sort of democracies, and there simply isn't another alternative. It's clearly the sort of historical arc in which we're all heading. I don't think that's something that a lot of people would sort of really take as read. So America's going to have to fight for that voice and have something practical to sort of offer.
Great, thanks, Raghi. Constanze, what's your view on the Summit for Democracies?
Well, I have to say I'm a skeptical myself on the idea. There has been a lot of good writing on this, which I don't want to sort of regurgitate, but I think the problem with it is obviously that it puts the question of who qualifies as a democracy at the forefront, and sort of takes attention away as a distraction from the actual problems of substance. That said, as somebody who once started life as a trained constitutional lawyer, I think that long ago, I think that all of us have to quite urgently have a discussion about the architecture of our domestic orders and its viability, its legitimacy, and its resilience, because that is the resource for our foreign and security policy. We can't, I mean, the days when the folks who did foreign and security policy were a sort of priest caste, a theocracy who sort of said, you know, there is absolutely no need for us to have any feedback loops to the voters because we're just going to tell the voters what they ought to think. And frankly, we're not going to talk to them because we're much too busy doing important things, like talking about nuclear weapons. Those days are long gone. And therefore it behooves us. And we've seen what has happened here on January 6th, where I would say we escaped from disaster by a hair's breadth, and those forces are still very much out there. And in Germany as well, the AfD is sort of languishing in the polls, but it's still getting very high poll shares in the eastern states, and its legislative and lawyer battalions are working quite hard at undermining the credibility and the effectiveness of the institutions of representative democracy by sort of pursuing culture war in the courts, by trying to block the ministries with parliamentary inquiries, et cetera, et cetera. This stuff is coordinated, it's disciplined, and it is malignant. And it's increasingly, I think, internationally networked. And of course, it has links to the violent sort of street shock troops that they would publicly disavow, but they're very much there. And so there is, we're still not out of danger, and there is still a need for those who want our countries to remain representative democracies to justify why that is in the voters' best interest and how it can be done at a time when there are such fragmenting forces tugging at representative democracy institutions from within and without. And there's no need for any of us to be smug or look askance at others, because we share all those problems.
And Emery, you were in policy planning in the State Department, and with President Biden's announcement last week about the Afghanistan withdrawal, I don't know if you agreed with it or not, but certainly it's a promise that President Trump made to end these forever wars. But for many people, and I know you're deeply concerned about women and girls, this is a sign that, America's pulling out, and it could be an opening for a Taliban resurgence. Do you think that that's an indication that America's back, pulling out of Afghanistan?
An indication that America is much more realistic about the limits of our power. I agonize over that decision. And yes, until very recently, and indeed I was in policy planning during Obama's first Afghanistan review, when Biden did not want a surge and the generals did, and Obama went with a sort of halfway version of what the generals wanted and set a timeline, and we know how that worked out. But I have to say, as much as I ache for the women of Afghanistan, and I remember when Madeleine Albright was first highlighting what was happening under the Taliban in the late 1990s, it is just awful. Our staying there is not going to make the difference at a cost that we can afford and the American people will support. And it is time to just say that. And I honestly think, President Biden's got courage just doing it because it's ugly and we don't want to do it. But, we had to leave Vietnam ultimately too. And it was a terrible moment. You still look at the pictures of those helicopters and the Vietnamese we were leaving behind. But I think it's the right thing to do. That goes to a much bigger reassessment of what our foreign policy should be about. And it isn't just less military, more civilian, which is, diplomacy first, engagement first. Yes, Democrats say that, but then they have to also be tough. But a lot of Republicans have said that. It's much deeper than that. I think it has to be a focus on global problems. Climate is one, but gender equality is a fundamental global problem. We know this. We know that when women are suppressed, all sorts of bad things happen. And we know that when women are allowed to live up to their potential, lots of good things happen. This is still thought of as a kind of niche issue for a lot of the people who run our foreign policy. They don't say so, but it's not really seen as a global issue. And I want to tie that back to what Constanze said, because she's absolutely right about the transnational or global links between these right-wing extremist groups. If you really look at the folks who are following forensically the sort of digital traces, it's very scary. And there is a patriarchal authoritarianism that links it. Right? When Putin gets up there, what does he say? He basically says, it's time to go back to traditional values, women in the kitchen, gays nowhere, men in charge. And it's a very seductive song to a lot of people who feel like they've lost their status. The world is very different. Look at who's in the White House. These women are all over the place. These people of color are all over the place. We have to really focus on that globally. And I think pulling out of Afghanistan, as horrible as it is a first step, but it only makes sense if it's replaced with a much more holistic sense of what foreign policy is. And as Constanze said, who gets to make it?
Yeah, exactly. Raghi, you were nodding vigorously about Afghanistan. Why don't you tell us your view on that, please?
I think there's no getting away from the fact that I was in Kabul the night, I should say, that the Taliban withdrew from it, and watched the Northern Alliance, supported by British and American sort of troops, sweep in. from the Panjshir Valley. And I remember the last remnants of the sort of Taliban leaving, escaping in a sort of, bedraggled sort of way and thinking, this is it, this is, they will never come back. So to be speaking again now that to see that they are effectively will seize control in a very way that's sort of evocative, if you like, of the sort of fall of South Vietnam. I mean, you have this sort of, Ashraf Ghani's sort of government, almost impossible to see how they're able to sort of, withstand a violent overtake. And the first thing I'm afraid that we'll see as a result of the return of the Taliban is the absolute decimation of any sense of sort of free speech and the targeting of women and journalists. I'm afraid that is just a bitter reality that we know is going to happen. I also cannot see any alternative for America to have withdrawn. And it is that age-old historical lesson that the French learned in Algeria, the United States learned in America. Power is not legitimacy. Might does not bring credibility. And I think when the United States with its allies entered sort of Afghanistan to eject Al-Qaeda, the forever wars have metastasized Al-Qaeda. We're now talking about, its presence in Africa and the Sahel and Mozambique, and this just can't go on forever. So I don't see any alternative, but the consequences are going to be grim, primarily for Afghans. But I hope that lessons that sort of really sort of learned in Western capitals, that to put a banner and a label on a conflict that is so much more sort of holistic and so much more important to fight rather than militarily is vital.
Thanks, Raghi.
I don't see any other choice than the decision that Biden made.
Constanze.
Well, let me chime in here because I have a similar experience to Raghi. I was my former newspaper's defense and security editor and was in Kabul in January and February 2002, when it was sort of a ghost town and people were just sort of cautiously coming out, and you could see the extraordinary relief and the sense of having been saved from just a grim period of unrelenting grimness by this. And in the ensuing years, I remember going for evening walks in Kabul or in Kunduz, and seeing girls walk hand in hand, wearing their veils Persian style, with the sort of barely floating from their chignons. That obviously is has been over for quite a while. And wouldn't be safe. It hasn't been safe to go for evening walks in Kabul, I know, for a long time. But I have the same kind of emotional attachment and the same regret. I think that all of us feel, and I think we do need to ask ourselves whether the construct of the forever war is will be seen, how that will be read elsewhere, including in Afghanistan. Whether it isn't just read as an excuse to get the hell out because we think we failed and we don't know what else to do. It does beg the question of how under what principles and with what means we intend to support civil societies beyond the West. In Belarus and Hong Kong come to mind, Ukraine comes to mind, but also Afghanistan, obviously. And I wrote a sort of democracy action plan in one of these sort of transatlantic position reports a couple months ago, and the way I put it there was to say that we cannot. It will look cynical if we say democracy is for the West and everybody else has to lives in the jungle, as far as we're concerned, and that can't be the road to go. But I think we have to frame this as a support for civil societies on their terms, not on ours. And that implies listening to them and not, offering binary framings as in, either you're in a NATO membership process or you're not. Either you've got MAP or you're in the jungle or in a Russian sphere of influence. That I think is something that we're going to really have to give a lot of thought to.
Yeah, indeed. Just to switch a little, Raghi mentioned soft power, and Anne-Marie, you've worked with Joe and I for years at the Aspen Strategy Group, and I'm sure at Harvard. We all know about soft power. Do you think that some of the soft power damage that has been done is reparable? Like, what's your view now on the global perception of American soft power?
It's a great question. And yes, Constanze and I both started out as lawyers, and are both not about, well, actually, I don't believe women should hide their age, but so 40 years ago in 1983, or no, yeah, 1981 or 82, I was in Oxford studying as a master's, and Joe Nye, who was a young professor at that point and had been a Rhodes Scholar, came to speak at Brasenose College, and I was there as a master's student, and I was just spellbound. You know, when Joe is talking, just these perfectly formed sentences, saying perfectly strong, intelligent, insightful things just rolled out of his mouth. So when I got back to Harvard in 1985 as a law student, I went charging down to his office at the Kennedy School and said, I want to be a research assistant. I want to teach for you, whatever it is. And he's been a friend and mentor ever since. And, you know, to give Joe credit, just an aside here, Joe's written 5 books that are more or less about soft power after the first one called Soft Power. And he gave the soft power talk so many times that I think I could have given it for him. I mean, I had heard every line of it. And that's what it took to get the Pentagon using the idea of soft power. I mean, for those of us who get tired of our own ideas and who think, you know, you write something and you move on to the next thing, which is very tempting. I use that as an object lesson in what it is to be a public intellectual and change the debate. And Joe has done that. Of course, he's also served in office. Interestingly, I think our strongest soft power now is our willingness to confront our flaws, our worst sins. They're more than flaws. What has the best thing that has happened for us globally was certainly not Trump. It was Black Lives Matter. It was seeing Americans, multiracial groups of Americans, flood into the streets and be willing not to look away and be willing to hold the government to account. And that is a long journey, right? With just this week, we had a conviction in the Chauvin trial, and we had the killing of a 16-year-old African-American girl with a knife by a cop with a gun the next day. But honestly, I think countries around the world see 2 things. One, they should see the ways in which we increasingly reflect the world. I mean, becoming a plurality country is by far the greatest global soft power we could have. We reflect every other country out there, and we can be tied to every other country out there. But equally, our willingness to, and that's always been, I think, our greatest strength, to say, here's what we say, here are the words of the Declaration of Independence, and all people are created equal. And here's what we do. And let's look at the gap between those, and let's not let ourselves off the hook. That's a very different soft power than Hollywood and all the other things Joe pointed to, but I think it's a powerful power.
That certainly is, Anne-Marie. Raghi, you're there in London, and I mean, you guys are dealing with this on the front lines. What are your thoughts on America's soft power leadership on this topic?
I think that's an excellent point that was just made, because when one mentions sort of soft power, you reach immediately for the institutional aspects and representations of American soft power internationally, you know, this USAID and so forth, and also the sort of thematic representations of it. But the fact is, I think America's true exceptionalism is the fact that it looks like the rest of the world. You know, you could be from anywhere, whether it's a refugee camp from Dabab and end up in Congress, as Ilhan Omar has, or the fact that although, you know, the United States doesn't measure, you know, immigration along sort of, you know, religious lines, but the fact is that after 9/11, immigration from predominantly Muslim countries actually increased. So things like the sort of the Muslim ban, I know it's got a sort of different name, speak to an inwardness and an exclusivity that America represents, or that's the perception here. I mean, in the UK, but also the rest of the world. I mean, I have family that live in Kenya, in Ethiopia, all over the sort of world. And when we talked about around, you know, our virtual Zoom kitchen table, it would be about that, how far away America seems in its role in the world. And I think that, you know, when Anne-Marie talked about the sort of anniversaries of 2026 and what's been called the browning of America, I far prefer the sort of the plurality of America, that it'll be a very, very sort of different country to the one that, you know, we've seen internationally over the last few years. That really is something. If people around the world can imagine themselves in America, or America, you know, representing something to them in terms of their problems and their worldview, I think that's a start. But I do go back to also the fact that, you know, America, the United States, in terms of its footprint on the ground in the world, has been very, very like a one-eyed cyclops when it comes to sort of soft power, and it has to sort of deliver something on the ground as well as the sort of aspirational aspects that it represents.
Great, thanks. Constanze, any point on the soft power question for you before I go back to Warwick so he can go to the audience for questions?
Well, look, I agree with Anne-Marie that the historically large and diverse demonstration after the murder of George Floyd, I think were immensely reassuring, not just to sort of decent citizens of this country, but also to the rest of the world. I thought those were astounding. And the fact that half of this country now is vaccinated at least once, you know, the incredible surge in vaccinations that has happened here in the last weeks. And I've got both vaccinations, and I am a German. I just live here as a guest. Nobody asked me for my passport or for my insurance card. I find that profoundly touching. I just, to me, that is just the epitome of you know, what makes America great. And yet at the same time, you know, we have seen the astounding malignance of the events of January 6th, you know, which was a revolution or an attempted revolution, insurrection that tried to televise itself. And in the course of that day, of those hours, showed us just the most astounding facets of moral ugliness that you could have expected. It was riveting and horrifying, and I, for one, am not over that moment yet. And I suspect neither are many of us, particularly if you were living in DC at the time. So, and at the same time, you know, I'm sitting here looking at images of my own country, sort of Nazis rampaging on the streets, or German QAnon adepts, who, by the way, tried to storm the Bundestag last fall and were kept back by police. But they were, you know, it was a much smaller group and much less determined and nasty than the one that acted here. But so, you know, this is everywhere, and I think that we are probably going to be working on trying to keep the forces of darkness at bay for the rest of our personal lifetimes.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And thanks to you all for the thoughts. I'm going to pass it back to Warwick now, because I'm sure our audience has some questions for the panel. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you all for such a fascinating discussion. I do want to remind our members who are watching that you can submit a question by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen and typing it in. Incredibly enough, this is the first event where we actually have not received a question from the audience, but I imagine that everyone was just—
There is one in the Q&A. There's one about the
that's a placeholder. I'm going to actually, though, take the liberty to ask a question and maybe kind of get the fires burning up. This is just coming from me, but you know, not long after President Biden declared America's back, you know, China publicly confronted the U.S. at the summit meeting in Alaska, and of course now Russia is amassing troops on the border of Ukraine. And you know, I have to wonder, and I'm curious about your thoughts, that you know, are you concerned at all about the U.S. Ability to uphold its commitments if China, for instance, were to move on Taiwan, or if Russia were to actually do an incursion into Ukraine? Obviously, there's also the question of you know, the Middle East and what may happen there as tensions are inflamed. What happens to sort of the U.S. reputation and credibility if any of these actions were to take place in various parts of the world?
Marie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard question. And in some ways, I'm thinking about Suez, for instance, as that moment when it was absolutely clear that that France and Britain had ceded their power to the United States, because there came, a moment in which they wanted one thing and the US wanted another, and the US got what it wanted. And there have been many such moments. And so you can imagine, if China really moves on Taiwan militarily, that is a nightmare scenario. And, as a representative of the US foreign policy makers, I don't know. I know that, if I were there, nuclear war with China, on the other hand, to do nothing. I mean, so obviously those are flashpoints. They're terribly dangerous because of the risk of miscalculation. And you think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to launching a nuclear weapons. So there's that danger, but there's also the kind of moment where things change in a way that cannot be put back. So what I do think is that the United States understands that this is not about us versus China or us versus Russia, if us means US. This has to be about a whole group of allies, fellow travelers, friends, who are going to respond together. And in that sense, the best thing we can do is not to saber rattle with China. It's to work really hard with lots of other countries. And to go back to what Raghi said, I agree with you. You look at Africa, and China has built large parts of Africa. If I'm focused on the people of the world, I'm glad that they have bridges and roads and other things. I really am. Who am I to say, no, I'm sorry, that government built it. Ours won't, but you shouldn't have it. But there are other ways we can still work with those governments. And so my view of that is, if we just see the world in great terms of great power competition, that's a very scary question. If we think about, again, what is our foreign policy orientation more broadly, and what countries can we bring along with us, then I think we've got more resources to avoid that.
I think that's one of the sort of consequences of sort of withdrawing from the sort of forever wars, is that when Joe Biden says America is back, everyone sort of looks at them and says, great, okay, it's down to you. I mean, I think that's part of the sort of problem, is that phrase sort of sets it up as though the sheriff is back in town and everybody else get out of the way, whereas in fact the greatest fear, and I've no doubt that something will sort of happen, that China and Russia, and quite frankly even Iran, will push the envelope and really test and present the United States, or the Biden administration, with an incredibly difficult, and this is an exhausted country. I mean, both internally of what it's sort of been through, and because of its sort of foreign engagements over the last sort of 12, 14 years. Where it doesn't need to be something as nightmarish and hellish as a sort of a Chinese military move on Taiwan. It can be something, as I say, the Iranians, blowing the side out of a, American aircraft carrier in the Gulf, or something like that. But a real sort of test, and whether the United States has the capacity, the multilateral sort of ability to respond in any sort of meaningful sort of way is different. But I doubt, though, Anne-Marie, I get the sense on this side of the Atlantic that when you hear America is back, it feels like, for most Europeans, it means, right, America's going to sort of take charge. We're at the sort of front of the line. Whereas I don't quite think that's what it really meant when it came out of Joe Biden's mouth.
The table wasn't round, Anne-Marie.
No.
Oh, I thought maybe Constanze, you were going to.
If you insist. Look, I don't read the Biden administration statements as saying, well, the sheriff is back. But I think there are those among. Sorry. Are you hearing an echo? I am.
We were, but I think it just stopped, hopefully.
Okay, all right, great. Who knows who's listening in? Anyway, I hope they get educated. I think there are those in Europe, including in my own country, in Germany, and in among policymakers who are sort of using that as an excuse for hanging back. I had a conversation with a bunch of military officers yesterday who wanted to sort of use me as a sounding board for their projects, and who sort of, in the way that they asked their questions, confirmed to me an impression that I've had generally, which is that I think that this administration currently is bending over backwards to say, we are here for you, but we're not going to say this is our way or the highway. And I genuinely worry that we are sitting there consumed by our own domestic worries and our own sort of, election periods, and are saying, well, let's see how this goes in November 2022 when the Americans have their midterms, and then, maybe we'll engage. That is not bloody good enough. And sorry, forgive the expletive. It does make me angry. And not least because it's sort of, childishly petulant. It sort of suggests that, we need to wait for the Americans to tell us what they want, and then we can make up our mind what we want. And grown-up countries don't behave that way. We need to have an idea of why we need engagement with America. And anybody who thinks that, we're all going to be sovereign in Europe and autonomous and sort of defend ourselves against interference from Russia and against interference from China is going to have to explain to me how, we will justify to electors spending 5 to 10% of our GDP on our defense. That is just not, it's just not good enough. The truth is, though, that there is an empty space, I think, both on the European side and on this administration side, on defining, hopefully together, exactly what we think Europe's and the Eurasian continent's futures are, and which ones we want and which ones we don't want, and what we intend to do together to prevent the ones we don't want. That's not clear, because this administration, I think, has made very clear it loves the transatlantic alliance, it likes Europe, it thinks Europe can be an asset, but there is a sort of big blank space behind that assertion.
I can't tell you here, though, Constanze. I mean, just the sheer sort of undeclared sort of silent civil war between within the sort of European Union about how America is seen, and not just because of the Boris Johnson government with regard to its sort of search for a new role in the world. You look at the sort of situation in Poland, in Hungary, and the sort of rampant sort of nativism that is going on there, and then the sort of
Absolutely.
what remains within. So when Joe Biden and the administration looks out at Europe and expects this kind of singularity of sort of purpose and everything, it just doesn't exist. You have a number of these 27 now countries at each other's throats politically and elsewhere, and that's an issue. And just going back what you were talking about earlier, Niamh, you asked me about the sort of integrated, whatever it's called, the sort of incoherent report that I've lost track. Really, without being sort of facetious, the sort of sum was, we're going to India. That's the great sort of, that's our great sort of hope. And I just thought, what? I mean, after all these sort of months to sort of, we need more nuclear warheads, and we're going to go do a deal with a trade deal with India. So, I mean, I'm talking from a country which is in search of a sort of some new role in the world, that does have, delusions of grandeur and reaching out for its sort of, historical, role, and pivoting, in a different direction each week. So when America is back, it's coming back to a bunch of sort of, teenagers that are sort of having a massive pillow fight when it comes to sort of Europe.
Yep.
I have one
Guilty as charged
on that, and I know we're out of time, and I recognize that it's always easier to sit here and see Europe looking better and for you to see the problems in Europe. But I do think this is a place where you could have variable geometry. Right? You could say, and you could have a couple of issues. And again, if the Europeans and the Americans could agree on even a minimum template of what a positive rights regarding view of the internet looks like, as opposed to the Chinese and Russian definition of the internet, that would be enormous. And you could ask all those EU countries to sign on who want to, right? You're in the pillar of foreign policy. You've got more room. You don't have to get everyone, and you're not going to sign a formal alliance anyway. But you could sign something that other countries can sign on to with genuine work to be done, and you could engage companies as well as civic groups, much on the model of the Paris Agreement. And again, climate, internet governance, I think there are kinds of industrial policy, a kind of self-sufficiency after the pandemic. And that would at least be something that is more than, after you and who's leading and who's not, the stuff that Constanze said, but wouldn't require every European country to be on board. I think that, but it would be worth trying rather than constantly looking to China and saying, yes, we like Europe.
Excellent. Well, thank you so very much. I'm sorry we've run out of time, but it was an incredibly important and timely discussion. And I can't thank all of you enough for sharing your expertise and your insights. Niamh, thank you for conducting such a wonderful discussion. And
can I make a plug, Warwick, for a program we have next week on Biden's 100 days over at Aspen Security Forum and Strategy Group? We're hosting Kath Hicks, who's the Deputy Secretary of Defense. We're hosting Jake Sullivan, and then a great discussion with Steve Biegun, ex-Trump administration, and Tom Donilon with Jennifer Griffin from Fox News, looking at 3 hours of what's happened for the first 100 days. Thanks for letting me get that in for us.
Of course, yeah, I've registered for that event, and I've actually shared it with so many of our members because it's a fantastic lineup. So we're looking forward to that as well. Again, thank you all so much. Thanks to our members for being part of this discussion today. We look forward to seeing all of you at our next SOF Digital discussion. And let me preview for those still on that we will be convening in person in Aspen this summer. And we look forward to seeing you there, and we'll be sharing more details soon. Best wishes, stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.